Ana koutou katoa, mihi ana ki ngā mana o tēnei roa. Ko Awherika ki te tonga, taku whenua tūpuna. Ko Tamaki Makaurau, taku kāinga rua. Ko Kim Locke, taku ingoa. So, as Jared was sort of telling you, I used to be a school teacher. I spent the first 10 years of my life in New Zealand as a maths teacher at Rangitoto College. I was also the Dean of International Students at Rangitoto, and then in 2019, I sort of transitioned across to the University of Auckland, did my PhD, and as Jared said, I'm currently working in their tertiary foundation program, which is like their bridging course. So firstly, just to say thank you very much for coming to the presentation. Even two of you are very much valued. And I'd sort of thought long and hard about what I wanted to say today, because I've promised to talk about the English for Maths program, but there were sort of three main reasons I had for proposing my English for Maths, or what I often just call the EFM workshops that I've been running at the University of Auckland. So the first thing was that I wanted to help international students just to thrive in their maths courses. But the workshops were also funded by a research grant from the Kate Edgar Trust. So they needed to contribute to deeper insights beyond just what the students said about them. And I personally think that some of that is really interesting and it has implications for maths classrooms. So I'm going to try and sort of mix and match a little bit between the researchy stuff and the here's this thing I've been trying and this is how it worked. Also, by the time I had completed my PhD, which was all about international students and their experiences when they first came into university maths, I'd sort of learned a whole lot of things that I thought or I felt needed further action. I didn't want to just kind of stop and leave things there. I had learned that a few international students do certainly struggle with the maths itself, but many of them don't. And yet, despite that, many of the international students in the first year courses experience quite a lot of tensions. For those who don't struggle with the maths itself, these tensions come from things like trying to access the math content in English. There's quite a lot of difficulty expressing their own maths knowledge to others in English. And there is also a whole big thing about understanding student-teacher relationships. So all of these things can create tension for first-year students. For the non-struggling students, when I look at these tensions, they mainly seem to arise through their interaction. So whether it's with other peers or with their teachers in the course, that's kind of, it's in the interactions that the problems seem to come up. And obviously, language seems to be the obvious issue here, but when I looked more deeply, so my research actually showed that there was a little bit more than just language at play. There was a whole cultural understanding of what collaboration is, also a whole lot of stuff about teacher interactions, but I'm not going to talk about that now. But these understandings of, or different understandings of collaboration seem to create all sorts of extra barriers for some of the international students. I noticed when I observed in their tutorial, so what happens as part of their first year courses, they all go to a weekly tutorial. It's a much smaller group, so around 30 or so students, and they're expected to work collaboratively in these tutorials. And the participants in my study allowed me to go in and watch them. And what I noticed, amongst a whole lot of other things, but was sometimes they rejected help when their peers offered it to them, even if it seemed like they were a little bit stuck. There were other times when peers would ask them for help. And partway through the explanation, the student would just, or not the international student, the one they were explaining to, would just turn away from them and ask the person on the other side or the tutor. There were some times when they seemed really comfortable joining discussion, but then there were other times when they didn't. So looking at all of these things, it seemed to suggest that collaboration might mean some things, or one thing to some people, but something quite different to some of the research participants. And that made it quite hard for them to work with their local peers. So amongst all the other things, so this was just one of the findings from my research, but if anyone had actually asked me what we can do about that, I honestly don't know that I would have been able to answer. So that's kind of where my idea about these English for Maths workshops started. I was trying to find ways that I could help international students feel more comfortable working with their peers, and it seemed like any solution or potential solution needed to look at both language and these interactional norms. So I'm going to get a little bit researchy here. I'm going to talk about a concept that we call mathematical identity. And a really nice analogy just to help you understand mathematical identity is if you think of your classroom as being a stage where there is an act or a scene playing out. The scene sort of makes a whole lot of different roles available. So students can choose different roles that they want to play, and the audience can then recognize which role that they've picked up by looking at their actions. So, for example, you might recognize a good student because they are working in a specific way or because they're interacting in a specific way. You might recognize the roles of disruptive student or independent student or anything else really, also by the actions that they take while they're playing these roles. And again, students don't stick in one role. They might switch between different roles over the space of a lesson, certainly over different lessons and over the year. But it's quite likely that they will have a preference for one role, and they may spend more time performing this role than others. So we call this preferred role their mathematical identity. It's sort of their expression of how they see themselves in ways that other people can recognize them. So it's got the two aspects, how they see themselves, how other people see them. The teacher also fills a role in the space, but they're a little bit like the producer of the play because they've got quite a lot of power in the classroom or on the stage. So they can influence what kind of actions might be recognized within these different roles. And they also have quite a strong influence on how the different roles are valued. So they might, for example, affirm the good students by, I don't know, a smile or a bit of praise or, even some really subtle body language. They might frown at a disruptive student or ignore the independent students. And all of these things kind of set in place a hierarchy. So whether it's intended or not doesn't really matter. The fact is these things do seem to set some roles as more valued than others. And mathematical identity then is this thing where students repeatedly take up certain roles, some of which are more valued than others. Well, I shouldn't say that is mathematical identity. There's lots of different ways of looking at it, but this is certainly one of the ways that we can look at mathematical identity. And the reason I told you all of that is because I use mathematical identity in my own research. So what I do is I look at the roles that participants in my research adopt when they're learning maths in any different situation. And then I try to understand some of the social forces that are at play underneath. And because collaboration is this thing that I'm currently looking at with my English for Maths participants, I've been looking at the collaborative roles that they adopt both in their maths tutorials, but also in the English for Maths workshops. And what I've been noticing is that collaborative roles were available, and they were also recognized in all of their prior and current maths learning experiences. So I have to say here that there were only 4 participants in this research. Again, I've discovered that doing research with international students can be really, really difficult. I had loads of people interested in the English for Maths workshops, but the minute they heard that they'd have to be doing exit surveys and interviews afterwards, many of them lost interest very quickly. So 4 remained. They were all from China, but I actually feel like we've had a really, some really good data provided. And it really does give a nice feel for what was quite an exploratory, my English for Maths sessions were quite exploratory. So it was nice to have the small group to work with. One of the students, so all of them had done their schooling in China. One had been to Foundation College in New Zealand for a year before they went to university. And basically the Chinese high schools, the New Zealand Foundation College, their maths course tutorials and the EFM workshops all had collaborative roles, recognizable and available. The thing that was different though, the obligations of these roles were a little bit different in the different contexts. And it's these differences that then get carried into your new context, and they sort of become integrated as another role or another form of that role in the new learning situation. Another thing is that roles that were valued in one context may not be so highly valued in the new context. And they might not even be that easily accessible. So all of these things, so, this availability, the values, these things create tensions between how learners can see themselves sometimes and how they are recognized. Because that's kind of the two parts of identity. So if there's a bit of a rift or a tension between them, it can be quite difficult for learners with those identities. So with the English for Maths research project, my early analysis has identified 4 collaborative roles that the participants and their peers seem to take up at various times in their university tutorials, but I only saw 2 of those in the English for Maths workshops. So I've given the roles names just to help describe them and what we were seeing. Your independent worker is a person who works on their own pretty much. If they need help, they go to the tutor, or I don't know what it's like in a school classroom, but certainly in our maths tutorials, they can, if they want to use AI, they can use the internet, they can use other resources. So they work on their own, they find their own help. The next one I called the co-constructor. So this is the student who works with their peers. None of them really know how to solve the problem when they start, but by pooling their knowledge, they together build up some sort of a way towards their solution. The next one, I gave a very fancy name. I was going to just call them helpers, but reconstructors seem to fit in really nicely there. So they're really just students who help. They already have the knowledge. They've either solved the problem already or they know how to solve the problem. And then what they do is they reconstruct or they help their peers to get to that same place. And then the last one that I noticed was what I've called the deconstructor, somebody who works on their own to start with until they've completely finished, but then they get together with others to discuss their answers and the processes that they used to get there. Now, if I think of my own personal experience of New Zealand classrooms, and again, this is not research-based, this is just me, the co-constructor and the reconstructor seem to be quite highly valued in New Zealand classrooms, compared to the other two anyway. And it seems like, looking at how my participants actually position themselves, that the deconstructor may be more highly valued in Chinese high schools. So although we might structure our own classrooms in ways that we're going to hope will encourage collaboration and make some roles more easily available than others, it's really the nature and the past experiences of the students that's going to influence which roles they choose to take up. And although I wasn't really very familiar with the deconstructor role before I started my research, it just wasn't something that had really come to my notice, and I didn't fully appreciate it. One of the participants in the English for Maths workshops really just put a new perspective on it for me. What they explained was that if students work independently at a problem, what happens is they might all have a completely different approach to it. And then if they go and collaborate with others too early on in the process, all of these different ways kind of get narrowed down into maybe just 1 or 2 ways of doing the problem, which then get followed through to the end. Whereas if they all follow their own ways to the end and then discuss the processes that they used and the answers that they arrived at and all of the stuff that they were thinking of, then what happens is they get to compare a whole lot of different ways of doing the same problem. And the people who struggled then can find a way that sort of works for them. So that's something that I hadn't thought about and hadn't really appreciated before, to be 100% honest. So the EFM workshops, which again is what I promised to talk about, what I had wanted to do was sort of to introduce mathematical vocabulary, because when students have learned maths in a different language earlier on, often the really simple things like, so there's terminology that's missing, something like, I'm just going to pick any old word, just say fraction, for example. If that's missing in your vocabulary, it becomes really hard to talk about maths at a higher level. And we often take these things for granted. We often don't realize how much missing vocab there is when students have learned in another language. So I was definitely wanting to enhance the mathematical register just to make discussion more easy. I was also at that stage trying to provide a safe space where students could make mistakes without any fear of being laughed at. But I was also trying to normalize this co-constructive way of collaborating because I know it's quite common in their maths tutorials. And at that point, at the time when I dreamed up these English for Maths workshops, I didn't really have the same appreciation of this deconstructive approach that I have now kind of learned more about. So the main principles behind my workshops were that the maths that was involved should already be familiar to the students. I didn't give them the new maths that they were learning in their university maths courses. I actually went back to school maths. I needed the tasks to be rich tasks, nice group-worthy activities. So there was an incentive to work together. I wanted the focus to be particularly on communicating with one another in English. And like I said, I wanted the environment to be very safe and inclusive. The tasks that I used were mostly from the Enrich website. So I did have a couple of others, but I think probably 70 or 80% of my tasks came from Enrich. Given that the students were university students, they were non-maths majors, but they'd done some schooling in China, and so their maths was already at many of them quite a high level. I wanted the task to be challenging enough, but not mathematically intimidating. I also wanted them to address this vocab from school, which had kind of perhaps been missed and would be helpful now. So just one of the examples of a task that I chose. This is from the Enrich Millennium Mathematics Project. This task was called Guess the Function, so you can look it up if you want to. But in the task, a person draws, or so we have like a little group. One of them is deemed, I call it the ruler, but you can give it any name you like. They draw a card unseen from a pile of rule cards, and the rule cards looked like the one I've got on the board. So functions are all hyperbole or something like that. The rest of the team have a different deck of cards. It has a whole lot of functions on it. And basically, the team had to work together. They had to choose a card to present to the ruler, who would then say, yep, this fits my rule, or no, it doesn't. And the aim was to try and guess the rule by presenting as few cards as possible. So it often generated a lot of discussion around which card was the next one to present. So it really did encourage discussion. And what happened, obviously, when the team finally got it right, they would then switch with the ruler, who then got a chance to be part of the discussions. The only adaptation that I made to this task was, and I did this with all of the tasks, I created a list of key vocabulary and a tally sheet. So what we would do is before the task actually began, we would talk through the vocab, and the group would then, as they discussed, they wanted to try and tally up using those words as many times as possible. So they were very intentional in using them because they quite liked to see their tally growing. So I used that with each and every lesson sort of before we began. But over the course of the 10 workshops, so I used loads of different activities. Some were similar to this one, some were quite different. And at the end of each one, the participants did an exit survey. Now, also just to fill in some background there, 3 of the 4 participants did all 10 of the workshops, and one of them came to the first 5, but then unfortunately found a part-time job, so had to drop out. But they all did the exit surveys of whichever workshops they'd been to, and they all interviewed at the end of it. So I managed to find out quite a lot of stuff at the end. And based on the comments from their workshops, I did a little bit of tweaking of activities along the way. Most importantly, I extended the vocabulary because they wanted more words. So my other vocab sheets usually looked a little bit longer than that one. I also always put in space where if we found new words along the way, we could add them. What they asked for was examples of how to use these things in full sentences. So just discussing their meaning wasn't enough. They wanted to actually understand how to use them, to see examples of them. I played with the idea of actually, oh, that was another thing, individual written instructions. So I would give instructions for the task beforehand, but I also found it was really good to give them their own sheet of written instructions so they didn't have to share with anyone else. They could read that once I'd finished explaining, take a little bit of time to absorb. And then the last thing that I played with was actually allocating roles or not allocating roles. So sometimes we had an observer and a scribe and whatever else, and sometimes we didn't. But as it turned out, I found that that was not particularly important anyway. Just one of the things I thought might be important, but it turned out that actually, even when I allocated roles towards the end of the lesson, they were all fulfilling all the roles and helping the scribe write and helping the observer observe. So as long as they were all participating, that didn't seem to make too much difference to me.
Just ask
Um,
them.
sorry?
Can I just ask a question here?
Yeah, totally.
When you're explaining these new words to them and they were asking for them in a sentence and things like that, did you allow them to, or did they want to use their home language to translate them and find out more about it?
Yes, so there were certainly times. So I didn't. Home language was just as welcome as long as things ended in English. And amongst the participants, one had far less English than the others. So yes, there were quite often times when we would bounce, or the other students would discuss amongst themselves, and then they would turn to her and they'd say, "Oh, it's like this, and this," and she'd come back to them, and after a little while, she would try an English translation of it as well. So yes, we totally allowed both languages. Everything was 100%, whatever worked for them was what was going to work for me. The ultimate aim though was to get it into English at the end. So that was, so yeah, thanks for that, Joe. I haven't been watching the chat because I can't fit it on my screen. So please just shout if there's anything
I'll
else.
keep you updated.
Brilliant. And also, if anyone wants to talk about the activities later on as well, I'm totally happy to send you anything that I've got, email addresses, all the rest. Okay, so student responses. Obviously, they were all doing these exit surveys, and the responses were overwhelmingly positive, even from the student who had to drop out along the way. So that kind of tells me that a program like this is potentially really worthwhile for students at, I think, any level of maths. So just to show you a selection from, and again, these came from various different questions along the way. So I just picked a couple. I am more willing to help others out and solve questions together. So, I mean, that one speaks for itself, just easier to talk with others. This one said a lot to me, and that was based on my observation during my doctoral research, where I saw students often try to explain, and then the people they were explaining to turned away. This one really spoke to me because it was when I helped others, they said thanks to me. I'm like, wow, it feels little, but actually that could have been quite a big thing. I felt more confident about asking questions and understanding explanations from my lecturer, so it carried through to like the teacher relationship a little bit as well. I like coming to the workshop because it's the only place I'll speak about maths questions in English. And that was interesting as well because they have these collaborative tutorials once a week. And yet for this particular student, she didn't actually get to the point where she wanted to talk to her peers in English. And again, it was because of her identity. But the fact is, she felt it was important to speak maths in English because that was part of her learning and part of her future. So this gave her an opportunity for that and definitely built confidence as well. And the other one was just makes me interested in maths because they were quite, to be honest, they were quite fun activities. I loved my Friday afternoons as much as the students seemed to be enjoying them. We had a really fun time together. But probably the main thing that stood out in all of when I looked at all the surveys at the end was confidence. So it was a theme that just carried really strongly through many, many, many of the questions. And I think it was just through having the safe space where they could try out all these unfamiliar words, they could have their efforts affirmed, they could laugh at one another when they made mistakes, because we had a lot of laughs. They could ask me how to say things that they knew how to read but didn't know how to say. So just as a silly example, if you think of a fourth root, for example, I mean, we know what it looks like when it's written and we know what it means, but to actually say that in English was not straightforward. You know, a lot of them just had no idea how to do that when they arrived. And there were lots of little things like that where the symbols are very familiar, but putting them into English, the words just weren't there. I know that in our 10 short sessions, I absolutely couldn't have added much more vocab to their discursive kind of abilities. We obviously added some, but like 10 just wasn't enough. But overall, there was a really positive impact on their confidence when they interacted with peers. And I think that in itself would have helped more to be added. Just feeling more confident means you speak more. So I think it was a really good thing to do. I wanted to just talk to you. So that was kind of like the EFM sessions themselves, but the roles that I was speaking about earlier, because those were really interesting as well. So I sort of said that in the EFM sessions, there were only 2 roles that came through, despite there being 4 in the maths tutorials. There was only co-constructor and deconstructor. And co-constructor was kind of the main one. Deconstructor came up once in a while. I found that really, really interesting because co-constructor was the role that they performed least in their maths tutorials. So the interviews was a lovely place to be able to talk to them about it and to just find out why they preferred one role in some situations and why they preferred a different role in others. And their various responses pretty much came down to how they perceived the purpose of the task and also their classroom relationships. So in the tutorials, they were given their questions, they were worksheet style problems. Now, some of them were quite routine and straightforward, but there were others that really weren't. But the fact is they each received a printed worksheet with this numbered set of questions on it. And although nobody ever checked their work or there were no grades associated with kind of completing the worksheet, the participants just felt this need when faced with something like that to complete the worksheet as sort of practice for assessment. When they came to the EFM workshops, they felt very differently about things. Here, the groups were given shared resources, and the sheet in which they recorded their tally of vocab was a shared resource. They were tallying the group's response. So they sort of saw their obligation differently. They saw their obligation as discussion. And obviously, it was an absolute privilege not to have to assess them. So assessment had absolutely no bearing on how they could choose to interact, which again, I think plays a really important part. The classroom relationships were also really, really important. Now, with the maths tutorials, the same 30 students are meant to be going to each tutorial each week, but there's very little structure in the room. So different people use the rooms over the course of the day and the tables all get shuffled around. So there's no kind of fixed seating plan at all. And what happened was that sometimes or in fact, probably more often than not, they were unable to find trusted teammates. If they came late, for example, they might not be able to sit at a table where they knew there was somebody that they could or had spoken with before. So often these trusted teammates weren't accessible to them, whereas in the English for Maths workshops, because we were a small group, we were meeting regularly, this little group became their trusted teammates. What they also said was that it really helped to have similar backgrounds, but they didn't have to be the same. So they said as long as, they would actually have liked participants from other language backgrounds. The most important thing would be that they felt really comfortable speaking with people whose first language was not English. But, because making mistakes in front of another English language learner was no big deal at all to them. But making mistakes in front of a native English speaker, they often felt was a little bit embarrassing. So that was quite a big thing as well. So that sort of structure within the English for Maths classroom helped a lot. So just wrapping all of it together, I think what I could say is that the English for Maths workshops were really beneficial in terms of giving confidence to the students to go and collaborate with their peers. So I totally recommend providing a safe space, giving some really fun maths activities where students from all sorts of non-English speaking or non-first language English can get together and talk in small groups, because this just builds their language confidence. I've put my email on the slide if you want to email me, because I'm quite happy to share any of my resources, but that obviously have to be adapted to try and fit the level that you were working with. I think also, though, what I really found, what I was really learning about collaboration was that there were more forms of collaboration than I had really appreciated before, and that all of them are valuable. and that they should all be recognized as valuable. So if a student chooses to distance themselves from a maths discussion in a classroom, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to collaborate. It might just mean that they value a different form of collaboration. So could be, doesn't have to be though. What I was seeing was this form where they bring a more complete idea to the party and then they dissect and discuss or evaluate that afterwards. So that was just a bit of an eye-opener for me, and I thought also could be useful for teachers in their classrooms. That's all I have to say. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kim.
Stop my share.
Feel free to join in with me with any questions you've got, either through the chat or if you want to unmute yourself to ask. It's made me think about we have an international intake at about the mid-year, and we have a course at our school which is trying to prepare these international students, a lot of them from China, for the New Zealand maths classroom when they go into it properly the following year. So it's been really useful for me to think about how you can actually be more direct with arming them with the vocabulary and choosing sort of tasks that are going to get them to understand how we collaborate here in New Zealand and get them used to that. So that's a takeaway for me, is to talk to the teacher who's doing that about some of these ideas, and I'll hopefully get her to watch the recording of this so she can get it from your mouth, not from my perhaps fuzzy memory.
Fantastic.